All right, so Dr. Nigh, welcome to the podcast and thank you for sparing some time and coming and speaking with me.
Certainly. Thanks for having me.
No, I'm looking forward to this. It's going to be a very popular topic, I think, for our audience, which is obviously around sulfur and sulfur metabolism. But before we dive into this, are you just happy to share a little bit of who you are and your backstory, and then we can kind of move into the topic of today?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a naturopathic doctor and an acupuncturist. I'm in Portland, Oregon, at Immersion Health is the clinic name. Let's see. I started practice in beginning of 2002. So it's been several years now. And in my clinical focus, I'm probably 60 or 70% treating cancer patients, some pretty aggressive and big treatment programs for cancer. But then, the other 40% are, lots of gastrointestinal and autoimmune diseases and Lyme and mold and, kind of all of that. So, yeah, it's a very, very diverse kind of a practice.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And how, I mean, with today's topic in mind, how did that sort of come about? Because obviously, at least from my perspective, you're quite well known on sort of the sulfur topic these days.
Yeah, it's a funny thing, So I got into sulfur. I'm not exactly sure so I work with a nutrition therapist, Maria, and when I went back through some email exchanges and things, I realized she and I had started, I had asked her to see if she could put together a low sulfur diet before I started talking to Stephanie Seneff. So this was back in 2010, I think,
Okay.
somewhere around there, maybe a little after that. And then I read an article by Stephanie Seneff, who's published about a lot, and was really impressed by it. And it was talking a lot about sulfur. And I started collaboration and conversations with Stephanie. And then there was an aha moment that happened with Maria, because Maria heard me talking to Stephanie on the phone and heard half of that conversation. And Maria at the time was doing GAPS, the GAPS protocol with a lot of patients. And many of those patients did well, but some didn't do well at all. And Maria had this click that the GAPS diet is actually a very heavy sulfur diet. And so that was in many ways the impetus for us to kind of go into this sulfur thing in much more aggressively and to put together a more robust protocol around it. And Maria, she's written a guide and diet process and recipes and so yeah, that's kind of how it became a bigger deal. And so, I mean, I know we're going to be talking about SIBO at some point here, and I'll just cards on the table that I really came to SIBO in an indirect way, because I had started just, writing and talking about sulfur metabolism issues. And then people just started showing up with these SIBO tests and telling me that they had hydrogen sulfide SIBO. And I had not at that point really studied anything about SIBO. But I thought, well, all right, let's just do our sulfur protocol with them and see what happens. And lo and behold, it actually does quite well with many people who have SIBO. So anyway, we'll talk more about that later, but just to say that I don't, I'm not going to the conferences on SIBO and how to treat it. I'm a sulfur guy when it comes to gut problems, and so I just do the sulfur thing, and it seems to work.
Brilliant. So I guess with that in mind, would you mind setting the scenes in regards to this? So what I mean by that is what people suspect with SIBO testing from a hydrogen sulfide perspective, but also maybe are there some signs and symptoms that we can start to use as well to kind of increase our hypothesis that there could be a bit of a sulfur issue for someone?
Yeah, so first of all, I actually don't really do breath testing. on patients. And
Okay.
most people come to me and they've already had 1 or 2 or 5
Yeah.
breath tests done. And, you know, I mean, I look them over and it's always interesting to see those results, but I don't base what I'm doing typically on test results. I'm basing it on symptoms. So what are those symptoms? That would be really any kind of gastrointestinal anything. And certainly all those symptoms that fall under SIBO, with bloating and, you know, sometimes pain or whatever that can go with SIBO, but, you know, also, you know, like ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease and irritable bowel and the whole big range of symptoms that people can have in their guts. When people have digestive symptoms, it's almost always that one of the first things that I'm going to recommend for people is that they consult with Maria and get oriented to that low sulfur protocol. So I get them on supplements and Maria gets them on the diet process. Beyond the gut, there are, you know, this range of other symptoms. And the annoying thing is that it's like pretty much anything, but they tend to cluster. So skin is a pretty prominent manifestation of sulfur issues. So, you know, dermatitis, people get it around their eyes or nose or mouth or really any place on their body. We just, we were talking yesterday. I mean, we had a patient who had eczema over his whole body, and it had been present for like 20 years, and nothing had really gotten rid of it. And he had other symptoms that matched, like, oh yeah, this is a sulfur case. Even if that particular patient didn't have other symptoms, I would have done the low sulfur protocol if he's got eczema all over his body. So we did the protocol, and within, I think he said like 10 days, his eczema was gone for the first time in a couple of decades. Completely gone, totally gone. So anyway, that's a way of saying that skin stuff tends to be very responsive to low sulfur. Then brain fog, fatigue. Brain fog is a pretty common across the board for people that have sulfur issues. Headaches can be significant. Often people have slow heart rate and low blood pressure. Not always, but often that's a thing, or heart irregularities, they get palpitations or whatever. Other things, hot flashes. So night sweats, hot flashes, and even like around menopause. Like, it's shocking how many perimenopausal women who are having lots of hot flashes. If we get them on the protocol, I mean, there are some who report complete resolution of hot flashes, which is, I mean, it's shocking to me. Like, I don't really know how to explain that other than that hot flashes are in some significant way linked to the autonomic nervous system and, you know, sympathetic and parasympathetic, and, you know, they tend to become more prominent when people are in a sympathetic state, meaning kind of amped up in some way, whether it's a thought that triggers sympathetic response or whatever. And when sulfur is not metabolizing the way it needs to, it tends to crank up sympathetic nervous system activity. And so I think in resolving sulfur, it allows parasympathetic to balance that out, and thus some resolution. That's my theory. Okay. So yeah, those are probably the most prominent symptoms.
Okay, no, that's really helpful. And I think what you mentioned there is probably a good cue to kind of just raise this for people if this is a new topic for them. So when we talk about sulfur issues, excuse me, am I right in saying we're kind of talking about people who have issues with sulfur metabolism, as you just said?
Yes. So, so sulfur is, it's all dietary, and for some people drinking well water, it can come in through their water. But sulfur, as it comes in, it needs to move in various directions to get processed. And to say that someone has an issue is to say that the pathways that it needs to move down is for some reason either slowed or blocked altogether, maybe. When that happens, the body has to compensate for that, because ultimately we need what's at the end of those pathways that the sulfur needs to go down. So if it can't get there in the way it's supposed to, it's what our bodies are good at. It'll find a way to get there. And so one of the easy ways to get there is to grow these bacteria in our gut that produce these sulfur compounds that ultimately can get turned into the thing that we need. And so in that way, I have this crazy idea that actually with SIBO and other kinds of gut issues, and in fact, with any of the symptoms associated with sulfur issues, the fact that we're overproducing these sulfur compounds is a compensation. It's a smart thing that our bodies are doing, and which is why that I don't have any significant focus on killing those bacteria, because I think that's a wrong approach. And my experience is that if you can address the problem, that the bacteria will go away on their own, because they're just there doing what they need to do, which is why I think that it is all too common that when people pursue those programs that are focused on killing the bad bugs, they feel great while they're doing it, and then 2 weeks after, their symptoms are back. Even if they're taking the right probiotics, they're eating the right diet, and they're doing all the right things, and yet their symptoms come back. It doesn't make sense. Like, why would our guts, if we get rid of the bad things that aren't supposed to be there and then do all the right things, why would our gut go back to the bad stuff? I think it goes back because we haven't fixed the problem that brought the bugs in the first place. Mm. So yeah, that's why I will do some like anti-bug therapy, okay, but it's not central for me.
Sure. And do we know in regards to what are some of the things that might contribute to that adaptation process within the microbiome? Does that make sense?
Wait, say that again.
So do we know what some of those kind of root causes are? So why is the body deliberately...
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, sure. Yes. So I throw them into 4, buckets. One is nutrient issues. And so there are certain nutrients that have to be present in order for sulfur to adequately metabolize in the way it needs to. And so, molybdenum is the one that's most famous, and I don't think you can really call molybdenum famous, but it's all right. CoQ10 would be another, and so there are glutathione, vitamin B12. There are these specific nutrients that if you don't have them, even if you do everything else right, you're not going to be able to adequately process sulfur. So you got to make sure that just the nutrients are present. So there's that assessment, and then supplementation in whatever way that needs to happen for that person. So nutrients. Then a second issue is around genetics, and genetics for me have typically played a less of a prominent role than it does in a lot of contexts. I do think that there are a few glitches that people can have in a couple of genes and that are relatively rare. I don't see them very often, but when I do see them, it's pretty much guaranteed they're going to have a sulfur problem. But there are some other genetics, CBS is the most common one, that get the primary focus when thinking about genetics related to sulfur. And it's one of those situations where I have seen, I do commonly see when people have homozygous glitches on a few spots on CBS, it is common that you'll see sulfur issues, but not always. I have had some people who are a complete wreck in their genetics, and they really don't have symptoms that I would associate with sulfur.
Okay.
So I look at genetics. I think it's worthy of, I encourage people to do the testing, and then we get the raw data and we plug it into various databases to pull the data out that I need to look at in order to get a better sense of sulfur pathways. And of course, sulfur pathways are all tied into, methylation pathways, and you got to look at the whole thing because there's no genes are working independently. They're all on these crazy big networks, and trying to just get a sense of whether or not the genetics are helping this person out with sulfur or probably impairing. And so if you find impairment with specific, if you suspect, okay, this gene, that gene, then there are interventions that you can do that are more specific around kind of stepping around what might be a slowdown with a particular enzyme. Gotcha. So, okay, we got nutrients, we got genetics. Then the third bucket is around toxicities. And the top of the list for me has to do with glyphosate and exposure to glyphosate. And of course, this is something that I have learned all of this just in my correspondence and work with Stephanie. And she and I have written a couple of papers. She's written dozens and dozens of papers on topics related to glyphosate and its toxicity. But I've come to understand that glyphosate, it's as though it was specifically designed to wreck sulfur metabolism. It is really shocking how many ways that chemical can interfere with sulfur metabolism. And then the punch in the gut is that we're all exposed to it. Like pretty much everybody has some glyphosate exposure. Even if we're eating predominantly organic, we still have glyphosate in our system because it's just so prevalent. So if glyphosate is part of the picture, so there are urine tests you can do and just try to quantify glyphosate. Now, a bummer about glyphosate is that it stores in tissue. And so we have to get people doing some detox therapies prior to doing the urine test because we got to do what we can to flush it out. But I would say glyphosate, if it is present, it has to be dealt with, and it would be challenging to resolve sulfur completely if glyphosate has any substantial presence. Now, there are other issues that come in, heavy metals, and so in the sulfite oxidase, where the molybdenum sits within sulfite oxidase, that can be displaced by other metals. So aluminum, cadmium can displace. And so it's possible that other, exposures like heavy metals can in that way interfere. Because if you mess up sulfite oxidase, you're gonna have sulfur problems. You have to have that enzyme functioning the way it needs to. Okay, so we got that, and then toxicity, and then the fourth bucket is it's kind of related to all of these, but it goes beyond them, and that is to say the balancing within the autonomic nervous system. And so lots of aspects of modern life will lead us into stress states, for sure. But including all of the three things that I just talked through lead to physiological stress, and thus when you stress, you activate, for the most part, you're activating the sympathetic nervous system. Beyond that, though, are sort of this much more complex link between there's this whole kind of a narrative now around the limbic system and the vagus nerve and the balance of, and it's really built on thought patterning, and it's a very sophisticated system of kind of understanding about how thought patterns are manifesting in very specific physiological ways and shutting down, messing up our guts. And in talking to patients, it's pretty universal that people understand that their stress level has a very direct impact on their symptoms.
Yeah.
And so there's a whole other set of therapies that come into play to help to balance the autonomic nervous system, which you got to be doing all that stuff while you're working on the nutrients or you're working on detox or whatever. So it's all, you got to do it all together. So those are the things that I am predominantly thinking about, that I want to assess in trying to understand why a given person has come into their symptoms.
So do you do much kind of nutrient testing and heavy metal testing within this, or?
Yeah, I don't do lots of it, but I do a decent amount of it. And okay. I do, there are various ways of doing nutrient testing, and I do mostly functional testing rather than direct testing. Some things I directly test, vitamin D and vitamin B12, and then other tests I'll do more functional testing. And there are some panels through various labs that are not necessarily testing nutrients directly, but there's looking at various, organic acid testing. For example, if you see certain organic acids, you probably don't have enough of this vitamin or that vitamin. And so I'm probably doing more functional testing like that than direct testing.
Sure. Okay. Excellent. I think that's really interesting. So we're kind of saying that within the concept of hydrogen sulfide and these sulfate-reducing bacteria, that is an adaptive response as a way to improve our sulfur status. Is that essentially what they're trying to achieve because of dysregulated metabolism?
I mean, there are a pretty big handful of people who would say that I'm completely full of crap about that. But so to give kind of the most obvious example of how I think that can be demonstrated, I've done podcasts in the past, and how they are out there, and I have had many people, patients, and also, but even more just people sending me email about their experience, who I have talked often about Epsom salt baths and the importance of Epsom salt baths, because they supply sulfate to the body through the skin. So it's nice because it doesn't have to go through the tube and run into the bugs. So it comes directly in through the skin.
Right.
And that sulfate can then be activated to, it's called PAPS, which is the active form of sulfate, and be put to use in the body. So what has been really amazing is that many people with gut problems, the SIBO stuff, just by doing Epsom salt baths, it uses a lot of Epsom salt. It's 4 cups, 7 nights in a row, soak 20 minutes, hot water. Write to me and say that their gut has dramatically improved just by doing Epsom salt baths. Now, I don't know a way of explaining that other than to say that their body got the sulfate that it's been trying to get. And so you don't need the bugs to supply it. You can let the bugs go. And these are, this is happening not in the context of them taking a bunch of stuff to kill off the bugs. I think the bugs will go away if they don't need to be there anymore. That's kind of how our bodies work.
Yeah.
Like our microbiome is essentially an entire functioning organ in the body, and the bugs show up and go away in shockingly short periods of time, adjusting to what the body needs at the moment. And so we don't have to necessarily kill the bad bugs. They can go away. Now, I'm not saying, if somebody's got an infection, or somebody has C. diff, I'm not saying don't ever kill the bugs. I think that there are appropriate times where you do have to come in with something heavy-handed. But as a general statement, when people have chronic digestive symptoms, I don't believe that the dysbiosis that we're seeing is necessarily just something to be wiped out. I think we have to understand what those bacteria might be trying to do.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think there are two really big things for me on that. One is the idea of this being an adaptive response. It completely actually aligns with all the research out there on the methanogens when we talk about methane. So then straight away we say, okay, well, that makes complete sense. It would be the same with these sulfate-reducing bacteria. And in regards to that sort of other point around not necessarily need to be eradicating these guys, I learned that quite a lot with Klebsiella pneumoniae. So I've worked with some ankylosing spondylitis patients, and obviously there's the research around Klebsiella pneumoniae being an environmental trigger. But what I've found in every single client is they noticed significant improvement in symptoms, but on retesting, Klebsiella pneumoniae was still there at the same levels. It was more like the relationship that we had with that organism has changed. And as a result, that sort of inflammatory response, I think, has kind of altered. So again, same sort of principle, I think, when we're talking about maybe this sort of LIBO, sort of the large intestine bacterial imbalance overgrowth, it's not quite the same as you say with something like C. diff. So yeah, I think that's it's such a powerful way to look at it. So we've spoken about Epsom salt baths. We've spoken about the nutrients like vitamin B12 and molybdenum that can be really important within this as well. Are there any other sort of interventions that could be considered when we're thinking about this?
Oh, there are many, many, many. And, I'll, just mention that I wrote a book recently, The Devil and the Garlic. And in there, so with, and anytime you write, for the public, if you're talking about treatment ideas, you can, obviously nothing about that is tailored. You're just giving ideas about things that can be used.
Right.
So CoQ10, for example, like if you don't have enough, you're not going to process on a certain pathway, and that's going to be a problem. So consider that in your selection. So there are the general things, and then there's sitting and talking with the patient and looking at their labs and coming to an understanding of what needs to happen with this particular patient. So I make use of a pretty good number of homeopathics, which there are some homeopathics that are very specific to helping with sulfur metabolism. And so I make use of those when it makes sense, because they can help with sort of some more nuanced aspects of sulfur metabolism. To just give you an example, so the company is called Professional Formulas, and they make a lot of really awesome stuff. And they have one in particular called, of course, I just blanked on it. It's called phenolic isopathic combination. So it's to help the body process phenols, which phenol metabolism is sort of like methylation. It's a tangent of sulfur metabolism. But in order for the body to adequately process phenols, the sulfur has to be working as well. And there are people who have, it's you can sort of get a sense that something ain't right about their phenol metabolism because of maybe reactivity to to chemicals, or particular kinds of foods, and it just has that look of like they got a phenol issue. I'll use that homeopathic phenolic, it's, just to help to desensitize the body to phenols, and that can often then kind of unlock their ability to get more done in working on their sulfur issues. So that's like an example. So I wouldn't say everybody should do this phenol homeopathic.
Sure.
That would not be a good one to put in a book for the public because it's a very specific kind of intervention. And the same is true around, various kinds of support that you can do around autonomic nervous system. There are lots of ways that you might address an issue of sympathetic dominance, for example. And that can be, you can do that with specific nutrients. You can do that with other more, like vitamin mineral. You can do it with more specialized nutrients. You can do it with other kinds of therapies, DNRS or Safe and Sound protocol, or these others that work much more kind of directly. I don't know if that's the right word, but it's just a very different way of trying to reestablish balance in the nervous system. And all of that stuff is really very individualized to the patient. One of the things that I recommend for everybody, of course, the Epsom salt baths are a big deal. Grounding is something that I think is crucial. Crucial, maybe big term, but I think anybody who can practice grounding, which is, just to clarify, that's as simple as standing on the earth, on dirt, with your bare feet. And there is a good bit of research on that practice. And what's happening in that process is that electrons are flowing from the earth into the body. And electrons are, of course, what are used to establish negative charge. And sulfur dysregulation is in a very fundamental way about kind of the disruption of an organized negative charge in the body. Because it's the establishment and maintenance of that negative charge that structures water in our body. And so if we don't have adequate, if the maintenance of that negative charge is inadequate, water destructures and it leads to all kinds of problems. So grounding is a way of just directly supplying more negative charge to the body. And so I think I think there's a very direct link between practicing grounding and helping with sulfur metabolism. So that's something that I recommend often for people. Another common recommendation is to do cold showers. Now, to say it that way is a little dramatic. So it's really a process of, from day to day, the last 30 seconds of a shower, the temperature drops down and down and down, to the point that eventually, generally, people get to where they can, the last 30 seconds is a full-on cold shower. There's no warm at all. But, it needs to move slowly in that direction. And ending in that way it ultimately is calming to the nervous system. It sounds counterintuitive, but heat can be overly stimulating. And to finish with cold, in fact, in the naturopathic tradition, hydrotherapy is, something that has been part of the therapeutics for a couple hundred years. And it's totally well established. You always finish with cold. Like if you do alternating hot and cold, always finish cold. Okay. And so anyway, that's another that anybody can do, and it's about as cheap a therapy as you can get. And so it's something that I'm commonly suggesting.
Okay. And that's kind of for the fourth bucket then, as in sort of that balancing the autonomic nervous system and activating the
Yeah,
vagus nerve.
it is that. I mean, I think it also has some important detoxification,
Okay.
because it's essentially pumping blood. Like when we do, if we're doing hot, blood is coming to the surface. When you blast with cold, it pushes blood back to the interior. And so, I mean, ideally, we go through a couple of cycles of hot, cold, because it just has a pumping action. And when you move blood in deep into tissue and then bring it back out, it's going to bring out some metabolic junk that can then get, you can get rid of.
Right.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. And I guess, it might be worth just touching on the fact that hydrogen sulfide has roles to play within the body. So it's not that
Oh yeah.
it's not that we don't want any of it. So if off the top of your head, are you happy just to touch on I guess this idea, like what role does it play when it's at appropriate levels?
Yeah. So hydrogen sulfide was recognized, I think it was like 1990, was first recognized as what's called a gasotransmitter. And these are chemicals that act like neurotransmitters, but they're a gas. And so they have very complex important physiological roles to play in the body. So with hydrogen sulfide, one of the important roles is that it's involved in memory formation when it's at the appropriate levels. And I have to assume that that's why if it's in excess, brain fog comes up and people get just cotton head. So one important role has to do with that. Hydrogen sulfide is anti-inflammatory at appropriate levels. And so it's interesting in that it is biphasic in almost everything that it does, meaning that it has one action at low levels and the opposite action at high levels. So at appropriate levels, it's anti-inflammatory. And you can find studies on, there are drugs, or I don't know if they're on the market, but there are lots of studies with drugs that they've developed that like an aspirin or something, but it delivers hydrogen sulfide as an anti-inflammatory. But in excess, it becomes obviously a problem in a lot of ways. So it has an anti-inflammatory role. Cardiovascularly, it lowers blood pressure. And that is a big deal. And that's also why a common question that I want to explore with people who I'm asking things about is, do you get dizzy when you stand up, or have you been told that you have, do you typically have low blood pressure? And very commonly people say, oh yeah, I always low blood pressure. My mom was always low blood pressure. It's kind of a tradition of low blood pressure, because when it's in excess, vessels tend to dilate. It also, it will slow the heart rate. And so again, that's another common question that I ask people, because when I check pulses, I mean, it's not uncommon that someone has a pulse in the 50s. And so if low pulse, low blood pressure, if that's part of the symptom picture, it points to excess hydrogen sulfide. With arrhythmias, where people just, because I asked, do you ever get flutters or, weirdness in your heart rate? And it's quite common. Now, I mean, everybody, once in a while, they get a little something, but it is quite common that people with the sulfur issue have significant something ain't right about, I mean, they will feel something is not exactly right about their heart, that it goes into weird flutters or whatever, something gets off about that. And then beyond that, hydrogen sulfide is involved in the immune response and in hormones, or sulfation is involved in hormone trafficking. And so, sulfation is tightly linked with, I mean, hydrogen sulfide and sulfation are all kind of tied in together, because hydrogen sulfide is a substrate that can be used to produce sulfate. I mean, that's the crux of the matter, actually. We're supposed to make sulfate in this way over here, but if that way doesn't work, you can make it by creating hydrogen sulfide, which can then turn into sulfate. It can be enzymatically converted to sulfate. So that's the workaround that the body does that ultimately becomes symptomatic, because we start generating lots of hydrogen sulfide in order to produce sulfate, but that hydrogen sulfide causes lots of symptoms.
Yeah, it's kind of collateral damage.
Yeah.
Brilliant. No, I think that's really helpful, especially those kind of the ideas of what questions we can also be considering, just to, I guess, strengthen the working hypothesis that someone's got a bit of a sulfur issue. And actually going back to quite the beginning, Dr. Nigh, I guess one more question, and then I have a little invitation for you if we have time as well. Just around sort of the sulfurous diets, like what would someone be, just very briefly, thinking about reducing within the diet if they wanted to kind of trial this?
Well, the biggies are, there are lots of lists out there. The most reactive food, and the reason I titled my book the way I did, is garlic. Oddly enough, there's the wonder food, and one of the healthiest foods, we're told. And for people that don't have a sulfur issue, it can be quite healthy. Now, generally, I think it's overused. I think it's healthiest in low levels, and not in the way that, some people are eating, now with supplements, you can get huge amounts of these garlic compounds. Garlic is metabolized into hydrogen sulfide in a very unique way, unlike other sulfur containing foods. And I think that's why it becomes the most, it has the potential to be the most problematic. So garlic and onions and kale is another that, man, there are some people just stuffing so much kale into their smoothie every morning, and it is one of the most reactive of the sulfur foods, which we find when we do reintroductions. Eggs can be problematic, and then cruciferous, broccoli and cauliflower, and so the thing is, there are two possible ways that people react. There are short-term reactions, and garlic is notorious for that one. So somebody who's avoided garlic for 2 weeks, if you reintroduce even a smidge of garlic, for some people, they'll have a headache within 5 minutes. I mean, it's really shocking how quickly that can show up. And there are other kinds of foods that can cause short-term reactions. So those short-term reactions have to get ruled out with each of the foods on the reintroduction. And then the other kind of reaction is not an acute reaction. It's just that over time, as more and more sulfur comes in dietarily, it's like it just backs up in the system, and eventually the enzymes that need to be working on this can't deal with it all, and then people become symptomatic. And that's usually more gradually, they become symptomatic more gradually. And that's, so I have a lot of people who, they just do the protocol like once every 3 months or 4 months. They just do a 2 week just to clean their system out, just to lower the level in the bucket so that they can then eat again, and they do okay. Yeah. Did I answer your question? I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, you did.
I forget what the question was now.
No, that's great. And I guess being mindful of time, Dr. Nigh, I must admit, and I apologize, I should have known this, but I wasn't aware of your book. So do you want to just sort of mention a little bit about this, just to plug it a little bit?
Here it is. The Devil, it's backwards, but The Devil and the Garlic. It's available on, Barnes & Noble and Amazon and all those places that sell it. And it really is just, it's kind of an overview of sulfur metabolism, and it goes through, I have a whole chapter on glyphosate. So it kind of explains, I've been told that the first 4 chapters are a bit geeky, and so it's my nature. So the first 4 chapters kind of get into, okay, what is sulfur supposed to be doing in the body? And then a couple of chapters just dealing with how that can get messed up. And then at the end is that sort of a general protocol of what happens in terms of how to unlock things. And so I give, and there's kind of the standard list of the sulfur foods that get eliminated. Now, Maria has, she's written a guide with a much more complete list of foods to eliminate, and there's a lot more. I mean, it's awesome to have someone like that I refer to, because she can work with people in a much more individualized way. The guide, on our website, there's a shop, and the guide can be purchased from the shop for people who just want to see what that guide looks like. So yeah, that's the book.
Awesome. I'm going to definitely check it out. What's the website, Dr. Nigh, for everyone listening?
Oh yeah, it's immersionhealthpdx.com.
Okay, brilliant. And as we've got a few minutes, just to pick your brain, have you read much? Is it cysteine that can be converted to hydrogen sulfide by certain microbes?
Oh yeah, sure, yeah. Yeah, so cysteine can, there are a lot of ways that cysteine can become hydrogen sulfide. And it can, there are bugs that will do that. There are enzymes in us that will do that. And so cysteine is definitely a major substrate for the generation of hydrogen sulfide. And there are people that, if you give them NaC, for example, that is not going to be tolerated. For that reason, it causes all the sulfur symptoms. Yeah.
So is that, apart from NaC, I assume from like a dietary perspective, that's not something that we need to be thinking about in regards to kind of cysteine?
The major dietary source of cysteine is protein, and especially animal products. And in fact, the primary dietary source of sulfur generally is in animal products, because of the cysteine and methionine that's built into the protein.
Okay.
That said, my experience is that most people, even people with a sulfur issue, most people don't have a problem when they reintroduce animal protein, which is curious to me. Now, that's not universally true. I just followed up with somebody who, didn't work at all when he reintroduced red meat. But generally, I don't find proteins to be the most reactive. I find it mostly in the vegetables.
Yeah. And I think it's fascinating that, garlic and onion are two of the big ones, because obviously most of us think about that from a FODMAP reactivity perspective.
Yeah. And I've had many people come in and who are eating a low FODMAP diet, and we will do the low sulfur diet. And what we find is that actually they had a sulfur problem. It wasn't really a FODMAP problem, because they can eat some of those FODMAP foods that are not high in sulfur, and they do fine.
Just to muddy the water a little bit.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And the fact is that there's so much overlap. Sulfur overlaps with histamine, and it overlaps with FODMAP. And I'm certainly not claiming that sulfur explains everything. It's just one of those things that most people have tried lots of different diets, and most of the people I work with have already tried, 27 different kinds of diet, and often are, they've eliminated foods down to the point that they're eating like 3 things. And so in those situations where people have tried a lot of different things with little to moderate success, well, let's try this and see if it works. And commonly, I get emails from people who just, they hear me doing talks like this, and they try these suggestions, and they send me notes saying this is the first thing that's made any difference. So
amazing.
It works for some people.
Yeah. And I think it's, to this day, it's less less well known than things like the FODMAP diet. So it's important to kind of just raise it up to that
Yeah.
level,
Oh
I
yeah,
think, ultimately.
for
Just,
sure. Yeah. It's
yeah.
good job security for me.
Keep it on the down low.
Yeah, yeah. You're only going to share this with your friends.
Yeah. Brilliant. Dr. Nigh, thank you so much for sparing your, where are we, this Tuesday morning to
Tuesday
chat with
morning,
me.
yeah.
Is there
Yeah,
anything,
absolutely.
is there anything you want to just conclude with or kind of re-emphasize?
Re-emphasize, conclude. Gosh,
Mm-hmm.
not. I don't have any like important take-home points. I don't think. I mean, if I would say the easiest thing for anybody who wonders if they have a problem, the easiest thing to do is some Epsom salt baths. Like that has probably been the single most dramatic response from people. Now, I mean, obviously there are a lot of people that it doesn't work for, but when it works, people are kind of floored by how well it works. Um, but otherwise, generally, of course, read my book. That would be awesome. And yeah, I mean, and I'll just put it out there. I do remote consulting all the time. I mean, people all over the world. I just have teleconference. And so I'm happy to work with anybody who would be interested in kind of doing more detailed investigation on this.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. It's been
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's a fun conversation.
Yeah, no, I think it's been super helpful, and I think we've covered a lot within this topic, so hopefully it will be a really good resource for people.
Perfect. Awesome.
Thanks, Dr. Nigh.
All right. Take care.